So before we learn testing, I think it's really important to understand the tools that we're using. Otherwise, we're just using things without thinking about it and we don't understand why we're using them, right? So here we're going to use JaZz testing library and Svelte testing library that can be replaced by any other framework you're using. So JaZz is a JavaScript testing framework and a test runner that gives you methods to test your logic. And I'm going to show you their site in a second. And testing library was made by the amazing CrazyJaZz and is only responsible for querying and interacting with DOM nodes thanks to JS DOM simulating the browser in Node. And it doesn't care how you render the DOM, but it requires a test runner like JaZz and works with everything like using a real browser with Cypress. Testing library also has packages that extend JaZz functionality such as JaZz DOM that makes it easier to test the DOM with its custom matchers, so you can check for attributes, text contents, classes and so on. And because testing library is built on top of DOM testing library, the reason why it's framework agnostic is because it gives you a wrapper around other libraries and the API is same regardless of what framework you're using. Because testing library only cares about rendering the component to the screen, which by that point gets turned into HTML, and then you can do insertions on it, and that's why it's so amazing and framework agnostic. The more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And that's not my quote, but a quote by CrazyJaZz. So testing library gives you a set of queries to find elements on the page. So you can think of this like document, query selector, and etc., which you can use if you want, but these methods really make it simpler to query and test elements. So you have the types of queries. GetBy returns the matching element and throws an error if it can't be found. QueryBy is useful for asserting an element is not present, because GetBy returns an error if it doesn't return anything. And then you have FindBy, which returns a promise that resolves when an element is found, if you have some async code that you have to wait for an element. So if you scroll down here, each query has their counterpart for finding more elements such as getAllBy, QueryAllBy, and FindAllBy. And you can read more about types of queries in documentation. So the other important part, based on the guiding principles of testing library, is the priority in how you should query your elements to resemble your users. And this is awesome because this can really expose, if you have bad accessibility in your code, how testing library recommends you query your elements. So we can see here it starts by the top recommended one, which is get by role, and the least recommended one is get by test ID. And you can reference this in the future so you know you're testing the right thing. But at the end, I still believe that it really doesn't matter if your test is working and you have confidence. And then you can also learn about other methods like appearance and disappearance that are required when you're dealing with animations, because you have to wait for those when they finish, and we're going to look at that also later. So for example, here we have a component.svelte, which is just saying hello world, and we just want to assert if that thing appears on the screen, right? So we just import a rendering screen from testing library Svelte. We import the component, and then, just as we did it in our test runner framework, we make a test that shows proper heading when rendered. We render the component and then we can assert on it. So we select the title by using the recommended screen get by text, and we use a regex pattern because from the perspective of our users, they don't care if the letters are capitalized or not. We just care does it appear or not. And then we can assert expect title to be in the document. And that's it. And let's now look at the resources so you can understand what we're talking about. First, shout out to these amazing library creators, in this case CrazyJaZz, go follow him. And then I recommend you also an amazing article by Kent when you're done. Read Common Mistakes with React Testing Library. It's going to reiterate all the points I made, and it's really awesome. So if we look here, this is JaZz, which is a delightful JavaScript testing framework with a focus on simplicity. So JaZz itself necessarily isn't for the frontend, it just tests whatever JavaScript code, mostly Node, right, and then our frontend. So you can see JaZz has its assertion methods. Here's entire API, so just like we've seen before, here is expect, then you have not to have been called for functions, and the list goes on, right? And here are some examples. So yeah, basically JaZz is a test runner, and that's all you need to know. So if you look at the testing library, it's a simple and complete testing utilities that encourage good testing practices. So testing library is what we're using to test our UI. So if we go to here, we can see what I talked about already about queries. So queries are methods the testing library gives you to find elements on the page. And here are some examples. And then you have types of queries, which we already gone over. And you can see a summary table. And this is the important part. You can see the priority from the top one to the bottom one that I just summarized for you. So it's easier, but I highly encourage you to go through this and read the documentation. You don't have to read it word by word, but just so you understand the surface area of it, right? And that's always useful. We can also look at appearance and disappearance. So sometimes you need to test that an element is present and then disappears, or vice versa. And that's really useful when you have to wait for animation and so on that we're going to explore later. And then we can go to the JaZz DOM. That's part of testing library, and it just gives you more matchers for JaZz. So we looked here at all the methods you have, and this just gets extended by JaZz DOM, right? So if you scroll down here, we can see you get to be disabled, to be enabled, and etc. For example, to have attribute, to have class, to have focus. So this really makes it even more easier to test your application. And then I just wanted to show you lastly, just so you know about it, is Cypress. And you can see with Cypress, you're testing with a real browser. If you load up their video, here, get the popcorn everyone, so you can just run it and we can see what Cypress is about. As you can see, you're using a real browser, so you see actually what's going on in the screen. And here we can see how a real browser is used for testing, and that can be more helpful and easier. Alright, so that's it.